Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Welcome to our event, Engaging Underrepresented Communities. My name is Shivani Sani, and I'm the founder and executive director of Creatives Empowered, which is Alberta's first nonprofit that is specifically by and for film, TV, media, and arts professionals who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I'd like to start today's event with our land acknowledgement. So we are a nonprofit that serves all racialized talent, all IBPOC talent within the colonial boundary known as Alberta, and we acknowledge that we live and work and play on the traditional treaty territories of 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10, along with the Métis Nation regions of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. We acknowledge that we are on stolen land. These are the traditional territories of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Specifically in Treaty 6, the Cree, the Dene, the Anishinaabe, the Saulteaux, the Nakota Iska, Nakota Sioux, and Blackfoot peoples. Specifically in Treaty 7, the people of the Blackfoot Confederacy in Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the people of Stoney Nakoda and Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wellesley. And specifically in Treaty 8, the Cree, the Dene Ta, the Dene Za, Dene Sulene, the Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, and Inuit peoples. We express with the utmost of respect our deepest gratitude for the manner in which these traditional peoples have honored the treaties, and in the spirit of reconciliation, we are committed to doing the same in how we live and work and play on these traditional territories. We are going to shortly introduce all of our panelists today, and we're going to begin with Samantha Kane, who is the CEO and Executive Director of Impact in Quebec. We're going to bring Samantha up to share a Black settler acknowledgement.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Shivani. For our Black Settler acknowledgement, we acknowledge the settlers of African descent and their descendants who were kidnapped, stolen, and trafficked to North America against their will or in search of a safe place to live their lives and raise their children. So please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and present, and how we each, in our own way, can work towards healing through collaboration, kinship, and the pursuit of justice.
Thank you so much, Samantha. So I'm going to start by introducing Samantha along with our other panelists. So Samantha is the CEO and the founder of Impact, which is a nationally federally incorporated nonprofit organization that combats systemic racism and anti-Black racism that serves a growing group of 100 plus members across Canada. And Samantha and I have had many opportunity to connect and engage in the national equity deserving community through various activities that we have all been involved in. I'm going to bring out our next guest or introduce our next guest now, Nilesh Patel. He is the producer of Roaming Pictures, Inc. He's based in British Columbia, and he also has an extensive background doing racial equity seeking work in Canada and has contributed to various organizations, as well as various critical and key studies and reports that have helped to create systemic change within institutions and organizations in Canada. And last but not least, we also have joining us today from Manitoba, Karen Remoto, who is also one of the founding members and a programmer at the Fascination Film Festival. She's also an independent racial equity advocate and a filmmaker in her own right. So I'm really thrilled to be able to have this conversation today with the three of you and to be able to talk about this really, really important topic, which is about engaging underrepresented communities. And specifically, what today's event is all about is helping us to publicly launch guidelines that we have collaborated and created together that specifically are for engaging equity deserving organizations. Sometimes that's referred to as equity seeking organizations. So that would be nonprofits like Impact, like Creatives Empowered, like others in other regions. And also these guidelines are meant to help folks understand how to engage anti-racism, equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility expertise. So we have spent some time this year with the support of Warner Bros. Discovery Access Canada, producing these guidelines through our lived experiences and putting together a document that ideally articulates how we would like to be engaged. And what I'd like to do is start with a little more context and help folks understand why we've created these guidelines. And I'd like to maybe throw it over to like Samantha, who also does the same type of work that Creatives Empower does in Alberta, out in Quebec. Let's start with you. Give us a sense of why these guidelines have been created.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. And hi, everyone. So happy to be here today. I know these guidelines were definitely created out of a necessity. Um, um, the, nece- the necessity to share the fact that how to properly engage with a sovereignty deserving organizations, as well as equity deserving and equity seeking organizations, like you had said just recently. So the guidelines are definitely a guide to. They're meant to be simple. They're meant to be concise. They're very much easy to read. They're informed by our lived experiences, as you have said, and the reason why we created these guidelines was definitely to, I guess, dispel the myth or the incorrect way of working with our organizations. Like, do you contact a Black organization a month before or 5 days prior to Black History Month? No, you don't, right? So it's a lot of dispelling the expectations or the ways of working that did not work for us in the past, and how to properly then engage and deal with us, and be able to engage with us, our organizations or individuals, for the future.
Okay. And Alesh, I'd like to hear from you as well about the need for these guidelines. Oh, you'll just have to unmute yourself, my friend.
Mute. There. Sorry, I made the big window small, and so it's hiding. I look, and I'm in agreement with what Samantha's discussed. I think one of the main things that for me is seeing this guidelines as an intervention in something that's been happening. In the sense that over the last few years, there's been a lot of movement and real material change programs, funds, etc., um, for BIPOC creatives and businesses to have more opportunities. However, within that, there's also been opportunities for white-led organizations, the institutions, etc., to really be managing and handling this and to be engaged in incorporating BIPOC within their systems and structures. And that's great that these things are occurring. However, it's been running ahead. And sometimes what I've noticed, is that they're falling into practices that actually don't take into account many of the thoughts, feelings, needs, and the history of exclusion that has occurred. And sometimes just taking advantage of the situation. So these best practices are an intervention to work with the opportunities that are occurring right now to get it right, for those who want to really, uh, work with a different set of people and to reduce harm.
Mhm. Thank you for that, Elish. So when we put the guidelines together, we also have a section in them that talks about who specifically they're for. And Karen, I'm just wondering if you'd like to share some of your thoughts on who the ideal audiences would be for our guidelines. Oh, you'll just have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. All right. So the primary audience is for the white cultural sector. So this includes the public and private sector, funders, including arts organizations, decision makers, executives, broadcasters, streaming services and distributors, unions and guilds, industry organizations, and individual producers and production companies. So those are definitely our targeted audience, and how this guide will help them see how important it is to be able to cooperate and collaborate with BIPOC organizations as a whole.
Okay, Thank you for that. And in addition to that as well, we've also indicated in the guidelines that other equity deserving organizations and sovereignty deserving organizations are also free to access the guidelines as well. We wanted to be able to put something together that ideally articulates what would often be a common response that an organization like ours or an organization like Impact would have to provide when we're being engaged, and there are perhaps some challenges with the engagement that can actually make the engagement somewhat inequitable. And that would probably be putting it somewhat mildly for some of us in the line of work that we're doing. We also wanted to root the guidelines that have been created in anti-racism. And this is why the title of the document includes the word anti-racism. And just for convenience, we've created our own little abbreviation, which is AR-EDIA, and you might want to pronounce it AREDIA. But Samantha, why don't you take it away and tell us about why it was so important to root this in anti-racism?
Right. Thanks so much. I just want to add before I say that I hope everyone understands that racism and discrimination, it cannot be eliminated as a whole. We have to take it apart. We have to dismantle it piece by piece collectively. So a rebuild will not do, right? So this is why we must create something new that fosters respectful engagement and becomes a clear path to lasting and meaningful change. So I just wanted to add that before I spoke about why we're talking about AR-EDI work. You can't have, I guess you can't dismantle racism without doing the anti-racism part of the work. You can't do the EDI work. There are so many, institutions, I guess, and places out there now that where you can get a certificate for doing equity deserving, equity, diversity and inclusion work within our communities, the communities that are tasked to do the work. And a lot of times our labor is free. You're asking us to do this on our own time and our own dime, and it's exhaustive work. So we definitely know that the AR, so the anti-racism, is absolutely required in order to do the proper equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility work. So there are, let me see here. First of all, everyone has to take accountability for your biases and behaviors, okay? We cannot stress that enough, the importance of educating yourself on this work and engaging with organizations and communities that absolutely have the lived experiences and continue to do the work authentically. So I'm going to throw this back over to Nilesh, if you want to add more to this about the AR component of why that's so important for this work.
Well, quite simply, if you do EDIA without AR, you don't take into account race. Like that's it. That's what it comes down to. I'll keep it quite brief, but Canada brought in equity officially federally. Provinces have differences many years ago. However, within the equity-seeking groups, they all included white people. The reality is, what we saw over quite a period of time is, in a white supremacist environment, when the equity-deserving groups include white people, they benefit from that. Not that people in other equity-deserving groups do not deserve to be considered. However, considering an environment, if you do not speak to or even preface this whole discussion with anti-racism, white supremacy will win the day. And that's why we put it there, is that you got to make sure that is taken into account and understood that, anti-racism is something that needs to be encompassing and thought of within all equity.
Yeah, there needs to be an intentional investment in the anti-racism part of the EDIA work. your activism, it has to be proactive. It cannot be responsive. It has to be proactive and responsive and not reactive. So, and I think we all found there was a lot of reactiveness happening, especially, during the first couple of months of 2020, when we all found ourselves facing, such profound effects to our lives, and especially those of us in the Black community. So just keep that in mind. I think this is definitely one of the reasons why we put this together, because there's a lot of examples within our guidelines of what you can do, who to engage with, and how you can go about locating us and finding us and engaging with our communities first, which is the first important step to then doing any of the rest of the work.
Yeah, and I think so. The guidelines are available on the Creatives Empowered website. They've been made available as a tool, as a free resource. They're accessible, and they're really quite comprehensive as well. There was quite a bit of ground that we were able to cover in creating the guidelines that touched on a lot of key areas that we as equity deserving organizations and individuals doing this work continually run up against. So, we're going to, one of the clear overarching themes that we arrived at, and a piece that leads the document is the simple fact that there needs to be this understanding that the work, the experiences, the lived experiences, and the expertise of folks who do equity deserving work, individuals that possess anti-racism, equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility expertise. There needs to be a clear understanding that the individuals and the organizations that possess that expertise have value, and that the work that they inevitably are being asked to do cannot be something that is provided for free or for very little. It needs to be appropriately valued. And, if, for example, I were to use Creatives Empowered, our organization's past experiences with some of the things that we've seen, it was quite common, and it can still be somewhat common, for individuals to approach us to help them with the piece that they're looking for to increase and diversify whatever it is they might be doing, but then have us do that work for free and not provide some kind of support, not provide some kind of exchange. So, this, this was something that happened frequently. And then when I began speaking to other people in the equity seeking community, we started to see that there was a lot of commonality. And Samantha and Nalish, and Karen, I'd love to just hear from you on some of the things that you've seen and you've experienced. Maybe we can give some examples of what it means when people are expecting that expertise for free. Just remember to unmute yourselves.
Well, I guess I can start since my example is upcoming. Everyone knows February is Black History Month, and I already made this comment at the beginning when I was speaking. Engaging organizations or individuals from the Black community for Black History Month to speak on your panels, to be in person at an event, and you contact us, late January or even December. Not enough time. Definitely not enough time to engage us. And I think one of the things I did want to speak about the most is how exhausting that is, especially when you're asking us to do that for nothing or little to nothing. So one of the things that I've stressed when individuals have come to me to say, hey, I'm being asked to do this panel for Black History Month, they're offering a small honorarium. What should I do? If it's a corporate company, I immediately tell them to set your fee and set it high. I mean, that's they can't expect you to do the work. And usually it's like an hour panel or perhaps 2-hour speaking engagement where they're asking you to do so much prep work for $0 at the end, or a small honorarium. There is a big difference between authentic allyship and performative allyship, and we can get into that a little bit later. I'll pass it on to Nilesh or Karen for their examples as well.
Sure. Like in general, it's the guidelines really delve into sort of, specifically what Samantha's talking about, and it's that expectation of just reaching out, um, to racialized persons, in the idea and sentiment that we should be happy, that we are invited, and that's just not the right idea. Like, there's clearly a need, and a reality around our voices, our expertise, um, and what we have to share, and the opportunity for organizations to engage with us. But coming in with a pretty happy, generally like a happy sort of sentiment of like, hey, we'd love to have you, and it's like a couple days before, and you haven't even been able to inform or really look at whatever the opportunity or process or panel is. um, we got to get beyond that. Math is probably a specific example, but there's been a lot of them. And the guidelines really point at how to do this in a respectful, authentic, informed a way, so that you know organizations get the best out of us and we can give the best to them, and that there isn't this feeling of being tokenized, since racial equity is in vogue. So you need to have one of us there. We don't need to be there then as well, right?
Karen, do you have any thoughts you want to add to this?
Well, I would say that I've definitely been asked to participate in usually the real inclusion or the BIPOC workshops, and it has been a difficult process to just let everyone know that in order to have me to talk to racialized communities or individuals, the baseline is just treat everyone with respect, and I think that's what these guidelines are there for everyone to know, is to be able to create a community where we can all come together, listen, and be willing to open to other people's perspectives and be willing to compromise and find a harmonious balance in working together as a group, for sure.
I'd like to get back to something that the guideline touches on, which is having folks, like having individuals, having organizations in the cultural sector understand that they need to take accountability for their biases and their behavior. And it's something that we say in the guidelines, we can't stress enough. So let's talk a little bit about that and why we've expressed this in the guidelines. And Nilesh, I'd like to maybe throw it over to you. And you'll just unmute yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, I got it. That's not as fast as expected, but getting faster. I think what you're referring to is taking responsibility, taking accountability for our biases, or my biases, my behavior. When we look at that, in this area, especially when you're engaging with groups who've been disadvantaged or excluded, or whatever term you want to use, and you're inviting them in, just inviting them in doesn't say we got it. We got this now. I think the expectation should to be at least to have a conversation, an acknowledgement of that exclusion, of those biases, whether they're microaggressions or other forms of abuse, um, that the other person may have put up with. And, these biases have always sort of devalued the expertise, labor, and time of underrepresented community members. And, and sometimes that sentiment of you should be happy to be here comes across and leads to expectation of free work for you getting exposure and opportunity, and this is just inequitable, right? Like, this is what it comes down to, is just an inequitable relationship. So taking responsibility for your biased behavior, especially when it comes to anti-racism, is a good step to acknowledge that, you know, there's a reason that you are reaching out, right? And that why you want to have different people in the room. And it's okay to say it. And actually can really help to inform and create space for different conversations and different ways to work together.
Any other thoughts?
One thing I did want to say is to keep in mind that, and we've seen this and heard, horrible stories about this, but microaggressions and racial microaggressions, they are a form of abuse, okay? These behaviors, they stem from unconscious and racial biases, and they must absolutely be taken seriously. So when you step to the plate and step to any one of our organizations or an individual person from any one of the underrepresented groups, just be mindful of that. And, be mindful of your own unconscious biases and whether or not you're coming with authentic allyship or a performative allyship. So I just want to talk about we added 4 key concepts to authentic and effective allyship. So show up, listen, ask questions, and speak up and be proactive. That, I think, will definitely speak to your authenticity.
Let's also take a moment to delve into allyship, because it's such a critical component to all of this work. The ideal for underrepresented communities is to be able to find allies. Not only within other communities that they're surrounded by, other intersecting communities, but also with communities that aren't normally underrepresented. And I think at this point in 2023, it being several years after the summer of 2020, I think it's safe to say that we have many folks from underrepresented communities have a pretty clear sense of what ideal allyship actually looks like. And I'd like to maybe just chat a little bit about that as well right now. It is something that's covered in the guidelines, and we can look at maybe we expand on it in the guidelines, but I'd love to maybe talk about the difference between what would be considered authentic allyship versus performative allyship. And Karen, Nalish, whoever would like to jump in on that one.
For sure. I can say something. So authentic allyship is based on your actions. So not just talking about it, but following through with taking initiative and empowering organizations to lead the work instead of maybe creating a side work about it and excluding equity deserving organizations. So having support is extremely important, not in just name only, but in terms of asking other communities what they specifically need, or respecting their time and their effort in giving them the space to talk through and understand if you can meet those needs. So those are really important. Effective and authentic allyship looks like educating yourself, obviously, addressing implicit biases, things like that.
Yeah, I think like with what Karen's saying, I think the term transactional, I think is something to reflect on when you're being an ally, right? Authentic. I think a lot of the harm comes, or the inability to work together over long term comes when everything seems very transactional. Going about what Samantha mentioned, like with right before Black History Month, boom, Samantha Kane is #1, go to Montreal, and then all the parts, right? It becomes very apparent on the receiving end when the relationship's super transactional. When an event, Diwali comes up, maybe for me or something, when suddenly I am in vogue, right? I've used that twice now, in vogue. But that's the thing, right? If it's going to be authentic, it's got to be around the clock. It's got to be ingrained in the organization. You have to be having your own conversations. And it just all this leads to you having a long-term relationship and education of your own and involvement with others in racialized groups, organizations, individuals, to overcome that immediate need that you may have. It won't be immediate, it won't be awkward, it won't be confrontational, and it won't be transactional because you've built relationships through yourself as an individual or through your organization, through investment on your own end. That's just all I'd like to add to that.
Samantha, do you have anything else you'd like to add to allyship?
Honestly, not much more than that. I think both Karen and Alish did a great job of speaking the powers to truth, because it is. I mean, there's nothing you can do other than to educate yourself. You show up, you listen, you ask questions, you speak up, and you be proactive. This is not, we're not flavors of the month, to only be engaged when it's like, oh, it's Black History Month. Oh, it's Indigenous Month. Oh, it's, so just, this is a lifelong thing. And I shouldn't even say thing. I can't even think of the word, because this is my life. This is who we are, right? These are our lives. We are these people every day of our lives. We don't just take off this suit at the end of Black History Month and then it's like, this free for all. I'm totally going on a tangent now, so I'm going to be quiet. But yeah, that's because this is important for me. This aspect of it, really authentic and effective allyship, is so important. I just can't stress it enough.
Yeah, I think everything you're saying is really important for people to read, hear, and understand, because I mean, again, like, as we were working on these guidelines, as we were putting them together, it was so clear that so much of what we're expressing in the guidelines is actually very obvious to us as members of various underrepresented communities. And really, if we just boil it down to one very simple thing, we just want to be treated in the same way that other people are being treated, in the same way that other people expect to be treated. And specifically, like, groups that aren't underrepresented. We don't want to be treated any differently. But there are so many factors that play into that differential treatment that then starts to take place. And allyship is a key component, like, to what that engagement actually ends up being like, whether or not it's authentic to us, whether or not it is impactful and powerful in the right ways, whether or not it can be successful. And I think, like, again, what I keep seeing over and over again is that underrepresented communities have a pretty great radar when it comes to engagement. So it's not hard for us to assess and determine, yes, what we're experiencing seems to be authentic, or no, it's not. And then it kind of really can sort of go two ways from there. Like, within all of that, part of what also becomes really challenging is that it can be really emotionally laborious for individuals and organizations to constantly be explaining why the engagement needs to improve and how it needs to improve. That's quite laborious to do. And that's also part of the reason why we decided to come together and create guidelines, because we thought this would be a way to be able to express that, in a manner that's accessible, and then at the very least gets people to start thinking about what their own engagement has been like. One other note that I'd like to just pass on about allyship, and this was actually a piece of feedback that came from a colleague in the equity deserving community, is that when it comes to allyship, it's not actually a label that you get to give yourself. And this is really important for folks to understand. Like, ultimately, it's going to be up to the underrepresented communities that you're trying to engage to decide if your engagement, if the way that you're working, functioning with them is actually authentic in terms of allyship, actually is allyship. So I'd like to jump over to another section. There's a few other areas I still want to cover before we wrap things up today, but I actually would like to talk about the value of the membership, the community, and the networks that equity deserving organizations have, and the value that individuals with EDIA expertise have to those communities. So I'm sure Samantha can probably relate, but like with Creatives Empowered, we have, for example, um, have seen situations where there is a request to be able to access and connect with the membership base that we have, which is quite large. But often there is an expectation that folks can just access that membership, that community, that network for free. So let's talk a little bit about why that can be problematic. Samantha?
Did you want me to start? Okay.
Yeah, I assumed you would.
All my examples. Yes, that is definitely detrimental. Absolutely. I mean, there are, and again, this lived experience coming out of the last 2 years with my nonprofit organization, having white-led and white-owned organizations contact me upon receiving large amounts of money from the either provincial or federal government, and then requesting that access to our membership, and absolutely helping them put develop programs, so they can then give the money runs freely to our members, sort of thing. Not necessarily to them, but the program is around them, so they're paying for the programs, but they want our members to engage in these programs. But we end up putting the program together. And I have done that once, and I will not do that again. It is very labor intensive. It's very exhausting, and there was no equity to to my organization or our organization or our members, zero. So it was quite frustrating to have that happen. So my, I guess our thought when we put these guides together is definitely be respectful when engaging equity deserving organizations. Know exactly what you're asking for. Work with them, not against us. And just be aware of the fact that, and it's not something that I've also heard a few of them say, well, it's for the benefit of your members. Well, no, actually, it's for the benefit of you and your organization, and the fact that you got this amount of money that you want to build upon. And why aren't we doing it? Like Nilesh had mentioned previously, it's like, well, why aren't we grateful to be receiving these, I don't want to say scraps because I don't want to sound so negative, but just know that there's definitely a better way to do this. A more respectful way to engage our organizations. And then we absolutely will support you. Absolutely. Just give us the respect we're due.
Any other thoughts from Karen, Nilesh?
Yeah. So I was thinking about that, like being an ally, and you get to put it so you like on your card, you're like filmmaker and ally, commissioning editor and ally. We should start certifying these and like have a little thing certified by Creatives Empowered. What Samantha's talking about in the transactional nature of some of these relationships, and the devaluing, right? It's a devaluing of the expertise and networks, the need of white-led organizations, institutions, and systems to access these groups. It's to be respectful to these organizations and what they offer, rather than showing up at the last minute and saying, hey, like, do this for us, we'll do this for you later. Just doesn't speak to really acknowledging why you even approach that organization in the first place. right? Um, that means there's a need from your organization or you as an individual, and you should really take that into account. I do want to mention, like, this isn't easy for organizations, especially racialized organizations, right? Because the reality is, why these guidelines are here is hopefully for these people making decisions to take into account what it's like on the other side, right? Because an organization who turns down the offer of networking, like of an offer like, hey, can you send this out? An offer of that runs the risk of what generally happens and has happened, which is moving on to another organization that represents other groups, um, because they're easier to play with. They're easier to work with because they don't stand up for themselves. And that's a dark reality, and that's why these guidelines are necessary, to not pit us against each other, pit organizations against each other, saying that's the one you want to work with, because they don't really advocate for themselves at all. They just do what we want them to do because they're put into a precarious position. And it would behoove organizations not to do that to us.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think that you bring up an excellent point. And it leads nicely into the next part that we wanted to talk about, which is the manner in which a lot of underrepresented communities can be viewed in general by our predominantly white cultural sectors. So often we've seen and experienced situations where it's really easy to take one underrepresented group, another underrepresented group, a variety of them, and just sort of combine all of them together into what could be viewed as like a homogenized representation of diversity. And we want the cultural sector to understand that you can't do that. So let's get into why. Why is it important to understand that you can't just homogenize all of us? Samantha?
Wait a minute now. Karen hasn't spoken in a while.
Karen, whoever wants to jump in. We all have a lot of things to say.
This is a shared effectiveness. No,
There's an implicit bias by Shivani.
No.
I can talk a little bit about this. So, like, in terms of stereotypes, positive stereotypes are also not a good thing. We can look towards the model minority myth as an example of that. Like, all Asians aren't quiet, smart, and all those positive representation of Asians being one specific thing does not mean all Asians are like that. It gives a bad idea of having one identity that is not always true, because we are all individual people, and you can't place us all as one thing, because we're all different identities.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Karen, for jumping in on that. We've been doing this together for quite a while, so we have this great rapport, and I love it. So yeah, I mean, that actually speaks truth. One group cannot substitute for another, nor can all underrepresented communities be combined into one big group of diversity. Because within these underrepresented communities, in all our underrepresented communities, there's also intersectionality, right? And acknowledging intersectionality means that understanding that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and oppression, and we must consider all the aspects that can marginalize people. So if you recognize that, so again, it's not a matter of, oh, this one group, and I'll speak to my community, one group or one organization or one individual won't jump on our panel for Black History Month. So I'm going to go to another one and have them speak on all aspects of what it is to be Black and what it is to be Black, especially during Black History Month. What does it mean for you? So again, I'm going to reiterate, do your work and give us the respect we are due.
And Nalish, is there anything else you'd like to add to this discussion?
Yeah, just I think Karen and Samantha have really covered it quite well. I'd just say, like in the specifics or example, it's in some ways, it can come simply down to, let's take the idea of South Asian, right? If somebody wants a South Asian, it's best maybe to look into what actually you're looking for is in South Asia is, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. Um, it can be that granular, although I don't think it's really that granular when you're talking about 1.6 billion people of representation. To not even to actually look beyond even our generalized sort of racial groupings, to get it right on your own end, and you'll learn something. Right? There's a lot of opportunity in that work ahead before just reaching out to said South Asian to hopefully represent all South Asians.
And one of the things that our guideline touches on too is this concept of oppression Olympics, and Alish did touch on this a little bit earlier, where when different underrepresented groups can just sort of be viewed as like interchangeable, right? Then it does become quite easy to, in comparing them to one another, to perhaps, unwittingly, unknowingly, or maybe even intentionally pit them against each other. And so oppression Olympics is that idea. It's this idea, this notion that, we're trying to measure up who from which underrepresented group is actually more oppressed than another. And we want to talk a little bit about why that is also problematic and why ideally we don't want people doing that.
I'm going to jump in here and just say that, again, how horrific that is for organizations, when we're being made to fight amongst each other for like this much of a crumb. The great thing is that there has been a collective formed now with a lot of our organizations. Creatives Empowered is a part of it. Impact is a part of it. I think there's about 30 or 40 of us all together that are really working together, doing the work together, and coming together as a unified voice in some regard. I know there are some things that we can't just have one voice speak on, but then we take the information back and we disseminate it to our members and our communities. So I think that out of the I'm going to say crap that happened previously, that at least is a really good thing that is starting. So I suggest to the white-led and white organizations out there that want to engage with organizations for upcoming events or months, then start with reaching out to those organizations. And I think we've named a few of them in the guide. And just do your work, do your homework.
Yeah, when it comes to this idea of oppression Olympics and distinctions between groups, etc. I think when you think about oppression, you got to think about who's in charge, right? The more that there becomes these manufactured paradigms of who is more oppressed, and therefore they should have the most benefit within this system, in particular within our media landscape. The more we do this, the more we let it go that way, the more the power resides in those who've always had it, right? Because who gets to decide who's more oppressed, right? When we allow that, we just fall back into the same place. There'll be more consideration for groups, but those who are deciding are the same. And that is actually the really key, I think, point to understand here. If we're actually having change, it isn't just that they change in how they decide, you change who decides and how they're deciding these things. Otherwise, we're just we're just giving them, we're just creating something where they just get a different sort of power. a power that appears more sensitive, more considerate. However, it's power and control to be able to pick and choose, which can and has pitted us against each other, even in these areas of racial equity, gender equity, and all the other equities that are searching for their deserved needs to be met.
And I think, if there's one thing that I think we can stress from this aspect of our conversation right now is that, I mean, just like every human being is unique, so is every underrepresented group. So we might have a diaspora, like a South Asian diaspora, as Nilesh mentioned, but just even within that, there can be tremendous diversity, and it really just comes down to understanding that when you're engaging with any individual or organization, you can't really be making any assumptions about them at all. If you don't know them, if you don't know anything about them, then you need to take the time to get to know them and to learn more about them. And I think just as a human being in the course of my life, what I have always seen is that when we take the time to just consciously engage with one another in a mindful way where we're not coming into it with expectations and assumptions, but we're really just taking the opportunity to learn more about each other. And there's an authentic intention behind that. It isn't about transaction. When we do that, we genuinely not only just learn more about each other, but I've also found that we also start to see the similarities between ourselves, and we start to realize that in many ways we're not all that different from one another after all. And I know that sounds a bit cliche, but I'm saying all this because it's really just bringing it back to, okay, well, we're all human beings, so how would we as human beings like to be engaged, and how would we want to be engaging others? We're going to wrap up in just a little bit, but there's another important aspect in the guidelines that we also touch on. And I really do think that this will probably become a jumping off point for more conversation down the road. But it's the distinction between gender equity and racial equity, disabled equity, and 2SL LGBTQIA plus equity. And I'd like to maybe throw it over to Nilesh, because I'm assuming maybe you want to go first, but I'm down for hearing from whoever. Karen, Samantha, we definitely have some things to say about this piece.
For sure. I can speak up about this. So in our guidelines, we talk about, this is for sure a fact. So cisgendered, non-disabled white women inherently have more privilege than a Black person, an Indigenous person, a person of color. They don't experience racism firsthand. They experience gender inequity. So these are two different types of equity. And it's important to realize that there is a lot more privilege with people who are white women, and they have to investigate their own implicit biases to understand that. They also have to recognize that they need to proactively engage in being anti-racist, because it's a long-term plan. It can't be just something that's short-term.
Nilesh?
Yeah, I think Karen really summed it up well. I would say just within, a lot of my work is really in the media landscape within our film and television industry through the equity work, but as an active producer and filmmaker. When we talk about gender equity and racial equity, the reality is racial equity or anti-racism includes men, and gender equity does not. And a lot of our industries focus heavily on gender equity and has for a long while, and necessarily so. However, there can be a conflict within pushing forward, uh, anti-racism in systems of that exist towards, equity when they're based on gender equity, and that's a big discussion in reality that needs to occur, is whether or not following another equity system that has excluded racialized men serves anti-racism or not.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to agree with what Nilesh and Karen have said. I don't really have much more to speak on that, other than to, recognize that there are two inequities. The two inequities are vastly different, and do not attempt to harmonize them. So, because this can devalue and perpetrate further harm against Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color, who tend to experience the outcome very differently and very negatively than do a cisgendered, non-disabled white woman.
Yeah, and there's certainly more on that in the guidelines that people could take a look at and read. And before we wrap things up for today's discussion, I just wanted to kind of circle around and see what final thoughts everybody had. Like if there are some key things that you could express today, some key takeaways that you would like to be able to have people walk away understanding, what would you say? So Karen, I'll start with you.
For sure. So we've talked about a bunch of things, but the main thing I want everybody to know is that you have to learn to walk the talk. So actions have the most weight. So don't just say you're going to do something. Make sure to follow through. Dismantling systematic racism requires so much effort, a lot of listening, a lot of learning, being open, being mindful, respecting that other communities need this change to benefit everyone involved, and be willing to be open to that change. Those are the main things that I would say.
I apologize. My lighting has drastically become different.
It's fine.
Bad, good, bad, good. Old Hollywood movie, Black Hat, White Hat. My takeaways are to use the guide. I think I would hope is that people can acknowledge that we've made this guide because things have happened. However, that there's still work to be done. And in one way, I'd also say is that if you're looking at the guide saying, well, we've hired Dan and he's brown, why would we need guidelines? Then you definitely need the guidelines. You can't expect by having any one of us individuals who are racialized in your midst now that they have all the answers for you. In fact, we have our own work to do between groups and within ourselves. And these guidelines are important for us as well, so they're important for you.
Yeah, and for myself, I would say to please remember that equity is a basic human right. And if you're starting to get fatigued, then your fatigue about listening to underrepresented groups, listening to us speak today about why these guidelines are essential, and listening to us ask for basic human rights, then you are absolutely in a position of privilege, and you should question your fatigue. The AREDIA or AREDIA work is a long-term game. So in order to really effectively do that, you have to create long-term impact, long-term strategic plans around it, not simply just short-term reach. And our guidelines are definitely here as a first step to help you. And just also respect. yeah, they deserve respect.
Thank you, Samantha. Yeah, well, I appreciate all of those final thoughts from everyone, and our event today around this particular topic was really meant to just sort of start the discussion, just like the guidelines we've created is really meant to start the discussion. It's really meant to be a jumping off point, but it's really an efficient tool for us as members of our underrepresented communities to be able to articulate what would often be the common responses we would have to the way that we ideally would like to see engagement play out. So I just want to thank all of my guests again today, Samantha Kane from Impact, Nilesh Patel out in BC from Roaming Pictures Inc., and Karen Remoto, who's based in Manitoba. All of these wonderful individuals have done tremendous work as racial equity advocates, as advocates for equity in general in our arts and cultural sector. And I'm so grateful to have all of you join us here today for this really important topic. Guidelines for engaging equity deserving organizations and anti-racism, equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility expertise is now a free resource, a free tool that we have made available on the Creatives Empowered website, which is just creativesempowered.ca. Thank you once again, everyone, for tuning in and for joining us today. Please take care.